Welcome to the Whose Body Is It podcast. I'm your host, Isabella Malvin. Public defender and feminist Kara Dansky returns to discuss her new book, The Abolition of Sex: How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. Kara offers a feminist, leftist critique of gender ideology and has appeared on The Tucker Carlson Show. In her new book, Kara articulates an invaluable and accessible left-leaning perspective that she hopes will reach Americans across the political spectrum who want to join together to push back against the enshrinement of gender identity in American law. Kara is increasingly optimistic about the fight for the return of common sense to public discussion. We get into the details of mainstream media's efforts to hide leftist critiques of gender ideology, the strangeness of supportive strangers juxtaposed with stubborn loved ones, false equivalencies regarding Jim Crow laws and gender identity, and the danger that men pose to women in women's prisons. Kara provides heartfelt encouragement for women tempted to withdraw from the fray, quoting the late Magdalen Burns, who said in her final video, "Keep fighting." What kind of state are you in this year versus last year? I mean, last year when we spoke, we were getting ready for DC. There was a lot of momentum building. Do you feel like a lot has changed in terms of people talking about what's going on?
Well, because I spend a lot of time tracking what's going on with the government in terms of replacing the word sex with gender identity, in quotes, as always, 2021 was depressing in the sense that after the January 2021 issuance of Executive Order 13988, which the Biden administration used to order federal agencies to redefine the word sex to include the words gender identity, the administration proceeded to do exactly that. And over the course of the first 6 months of 2021, we saw a series of orders and memos that came out of the Biden administration from, for example, the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, that redefined the word sex to include the words gender identity in the definition for purposes of federal administrative law. Of those, I'm sure your audience will be interested in most of them, but in particular, the Department of Health and Human Services has now redefined sex to include gender identity for purposes of healthcare facilities that are funded under the Affordable Care Act. And in doing so, the department completely misstates what the Affordable Care Act says on its website. It just is completely disingenuous about what the Affordable Care Act actually did for women and girls. And so now in facilities that receive funding under the ACA, if a woman goes in to receive healthcare, including gynecological healthcare, if she demands to be seen by a female healthcare provider, and if the facility provides a male healthcare provider who claims to identify as female, there's nothing that woman can do. If the facility prevents that in any way, the facility will be subject potentially to a claim of discrimination brought by the male healthcare provider who claims to identify as female. So the consequences for women and girls could not be more devastating. So 2021, many of us who work on this issue felt like we had a little bit of whiplash, just dealing with the onslaught of assaults on the rights, privacy, and safety of women and girls. I feel like things started to change in the fall, and I'm now a little bit optimistic about 2022. A couple of things that changed were the rhetoric that was being employed here and in the UK just became absolutely insane. And for example, in September of 2021, literally on the 1-year anniversary of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, the ACLU quoted her in a tweet, quoting a statement that she made about abortion during her 1993 confirmation hearings, except that in doing so, the ACLU completely erased all references to women. I cannot imagine a graver insult to one of the greatest protectors of women's rights in this country, especially on abortion, than erasing women from her quote on the anniversary of her death. So that happened. Then a medical journal called The Lancet referred to women as bodies with vaginas. So we got reduced to bodies with vaginas as though we have no other parts. And then something very weird happened, which is that in the United Kingdom, the top leaders of the Labour Party were saying that it's inappropriate to say that only women have a cervix. They said that women who claim that only women have a cervix are dinosaurs that are hoarding our rights. So, needless to say, feminists in the US and the UK were not happy with these developments. And then in October, American comedian Dave Chappelle said some things in a Netflix special that were supportive of J.K. Rowling, and in which he announced that he is Team TERF. So when that happened, I think things started to shift dramatically. And I recount all of these events in my book, which I know we're going to talk about. Mm-hmm. So I think there's been a shift. You know, a lot of what we talk about in this whole movement to protect women's sex-based rights is that it's frequently framed as one side over here, a marginalized community, so-called, going up against over here, the big bad Christian right. Mm-hmm. But the truth of the matter is that there is a feminist, leftist critique of gender identity that is not getting into the media. And I hear from rank and file leftists, liberals, Democrats all the time who are fed up with what's happening. And that's what gives me hope. That was a long answer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important. And thank you for bringing us back to the material reality in the sense that of what's going on behind the scenes, because, you know, I'm very much in this sphere of like storytelling and consciousness raising and like more people talking it. And that's the barometer that I'm measuring, like progress in one sense. Meanwhile, what you've just said is like this whole concept of gender identity has become more enshrined in the law, you know, particularly in 2021. And that's really important to know. It seems like the more ridiculous it becomes, the more people kind of snap out of it. But then we are going to be faced with the problem of undoing all of the legislative kind of things that are being put in place. So what I appreciate about what you did in the book is kind of go through some of the states that have had success, like with sports, like you mentioned. I think it was a bill in Idaho. Is that right? Yep. That had success with preserving women's sports. And like we see that each state is handling what's going on with gender identity in such different ways. In terms of the way, like the federal things that have been put in place versus state, like at the end of the day, when it goes to court, like what prevails? And can you give us an example of a case that, you know, is maybe even come up in 2021 where we've seen like the consequences of this, where there was a suit filed, like in the case of, you know, the example you gave with the Affordable Care Act and a woman, you know, not being able to sue. Like, has there have any women been challenging what's going on under the new kind of federal legislative, you know, things that have been put in place? That's my question.
So it's really interesting because I'm not aware of one, is my direct answer to your question. I don't know what's happening out there in the real world. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know if a woman somewhere in, I don't know, Kansas, I'm just making that up, but if a woman in Kansas went in to receive gynecological or obstetric care and demanded a female healthcare provider, and the provider provided her with a male healthcare provider who claimed to identify as female. I just don't know if that's happened. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I haven't heard of any cases like that. What I do know of, though, is a case where 20 states have filed a federal lawsuit against the Biden administration complaining about all of those orders that I just listed. Mm-hmm. And that's good. And the states make arguments that I think are great arguments to make. They argue, for example, that it violates states' rights for the Biden administration to do this. They argue that it violates the rights of the First Amendment rights of state employees to do this. And they make a series of arguments that I think are really high quality arguments. My organization, Women's Declaration International, filed a brief in that case. Even though we're not a party to the case, we filed a brief in the case, adding the additional argument that the Biden administration's redefinition of sex to include gender identity also discriminates against women and girls under the 14th Amendment. That's an argument that the states hadn't made, and that my organization, Women's Declaration International, is sort of uniquely situated to make. Another argument that the states made, which I think is a great one, is that these orders and memos that the administration put forth are totally in violation of United States procedural law. If they're going to change policy like that, they are supposed to issue a proposed notice. They're supposed to tell everyone what they're doing, and they're supposed to solicit public comment. They didn't do any of that. They just did with no public comment. So that is an argument that we totally support, that was a violation of federal procedural law. And it's not a uniquely women's rights argument. But the states did make it, and I'm glad they did.
So 20 states and not one made an argument in defense of women's sex-based rights.
Yeah, that's the case.
That's kind of, I mean, unbelievable yet believable.
They all 20 states are plaintiffs in one case. So they all made the exact same argument of necessity. So it's not like they had the opportunity to present different arguments. But this group of 20 states did not present a women's rights argument.
What is the status right now of what Women's Declaration International filed?
It's pending before the court. The states made a request of the court to issue what in legal terms is called a preliminary injunction, which would halt enforcement of the new laws. And so we support that, and we hope the court will grant that motion, and we're waiting to hear. Unfortunately, federal litigation goes at a snail's pace, so we might be waiting a while. But that's where we're.
Okay, wow. And so when did you start the book, The Abolition of Sex? Like, do you feel like you've been writing it since you started talking about this, or when did it kind of come to a head where you're like, this needs to go into writing and this needs to be dispersed? I know you sent out to congressmen. Is that right? You recently sent it out to a lot of congressmen.
Yeah, on Friday, WDI sent 535 copies of the book to sent one copy of the book to all 535 members of Congress.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, maybe tell me a little bit about when you started writing the book and the need for it, because I know you've done a lot of interviews, you've been on Fox. Yeah. What was the impetus for the book?
Yeah. So earlier this year, I had done, as you said, a Fox News piece on the Tucker Carlson show. And after that, a publisher reached out to me and wanted to have a conversation. And over the course of the spring, he and I had several conversations where we talked about what the book might look like, what it might say, how it might be framed, the outline of the book. And he was pretty clear. He comes from a sort of mainstream conservative libertarian with hues of classical liberalism political background. So he and I are not aligned on a lot of things ideologically, but he was smart enough to know that the message to Democrats had to come from a feminist Democrat. And it was an invitation from him to me to write a book that I felt might, first of all, educate the American people about what's really going on here. And second of all, empower people who already know what's going on, but are a little bit wary of speaking up. Empower people with arguments and language that they can use in articulating a left-leaning critique of gender identity. Now, having said that, I don't mean for the book only to land in the hands of liberals. I very much want conservatives to also read the book, because conservatives often fall into the trap of using gender identity language. And so I'm hoping that the book will reach Americans across the political aisle, across the political spectrum, who want to join together in a shared effort to push back against the enshrinement of gender identity in American law.
Right. And perhaps to clarify that, like, the feminist movement is not responsible for where we are, which I see all the time. Like feminists, made us, do this because we went too far. We need a return to what they call traditional gender roles, which like tells us nothing about what they're actually saying. I don't know what you mean by traditional. But yeah, I find that, I mean, and again, you don't have to be conservative to be anti-feminist, but I think, I think the world likes to pretend that that we don't exist, that there aren't, Democrats or former like liberals, who are challenging gender identity, and obviously that there are different kinds of feminist thought and movements all happening at the same time. So I mean, it makes sense that you would be approached by that kind of publisher, because I think a barrier to, like, when you address in the book, is just having a platform. Did you, like, before you were approached by this man, did you have the thought, oh, it will never get published because nobody publishes this kind of content, or I'd have to self-publish? Like, did that feel true before this guy approached you?
Yeah, absolutely. I am pretty persuaded that mainstream media outlets know that we exist,
Mm,
and they're engaged in a concerted effort not to
mhm.
let the American people know that we exist,
Yeah.
because if they could hear from us, we would be having so much more success, because I think we make a lot of sense. I think in particular when lesbians speak out against so-called gender identity, that's really sympathetic. When lesbians say the trans movement is telling me that I'm transphobic because I don't want to sleep with men. That's so outrageously conservative to tell lesbians that they have to sleep with men. Those kinds of arguments, I think, would really enlighten the American public.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, too. And like, I've used the heterosexual example of that too. It's like, can you imagine, I've said to men, can you imagine, needing to pretend that this man is a woman and that you should, like, you should find him sexually attractive. And they're like, what? That's ridiculous. Like, absolutely not. Yeah. So what has been the response to the book so far? I mean, obviously you've piqued people through this book, but have people kind of been coming out of the woodwork saying that, like, wow, it's really opened my mind, or like, what's the positive feedback that you've gotten so far on the book?
On social media, for sure. To a certain extent, I'm preaching to the converted. I know that.
Mm,
But that's okay. I'm
mhm,
not worried about preaching to the converted, because, as I mentioned, some of the converted aren't being vocal enough.
mhm.
And so if the book can help empower the already converted to speak out more, then that will be good. That will have been a goal attained. So I'm getting a ton of positive feedback on social media. My actual, what I'll call my real life, it is strange because I don't really talk about this stuff with people. It's a little bit bizarre. I went with my partner to meet up with a friend of ours who's a guy, and he's married to a woman, and we just made small talk. Not just small talk. We talked about politics, but we didn't talk about this. And
Hmm.
he kind of said, how is your work going, Kara? How are you doing in the kind of stuff that you're doing? And I said, it's going really well. I've been publishing a lot. I've been talking a lot in the media, but we didn't talk about the actual topic, because I'm always hesitant to go there.
Mm.
It's, I don't know. I just, sometimes it's nice to not talk about this stuff. But then after we left, my partner said to me, you can go there with him. He totally agrees with you. And I was like, what? And he said, yeah, he would be very open to having that conversation with you. So 2022 might be the year that I have more conversations about this topic with my in real life people.
Wait, that is so shocking to me. That is so surprising to me, because you're obviously such a force, and, like, unless it's a willful ignorance, I mean, I guess I don't know the depths of, you've just said, like, it was more of a kind of a surface, perhaps, like, relationship interaction, or you just stuck to certain topics. But I just
It's
take for granted, like, if you've written a book and you're going on national television talking about this, like, you must be talking about it all the time. But I guess I'm totally wrong to assume that.
It's weird. It's admittedly weird. You know, there's this one woman who I mainly know on social media through this topic. And sometimes I talk with her about this, and she said, is there any possibility that people in your real life don't know what you're doing? And I'm like,
Mm.
well, yeah, they don't
Mhm.
watch Tucker Carlson. I hang
Right.
with a bunch of social liberals. It is entirely possible that they have no idea what I'm doing. So I don't know, but maybe I'll talk about it more. It's also, yeah, I mean, the people that I tend to hang out with in DC aren't really my close longtime friends.
Mhm.
I just kind of know them casually and socially, and they're more acquaintances than friends. We don't
Mm.
tend to do a lot of deep digging into each other's work or
Mhm.
anything like that. We usually keep it to the level of family and vacations and stuff like that.
Wow. Wow, that's so interesting. It's my party trick. I bring it out every chance I get. It's like I've had people ask me if I care about anything else. I've had someone ask me that. Do you even like do anything else? Do you even think about anything else? Um,
Well, that's
but
exactly why. That's
you
exactly
need a
why.
break.
Yeah, like sometimes when I'm with my casual acquaintances and we're just having a drink and talking about the weather, it's like a breath of fresh air to talk about something else.
Totally. Yeah. I feel like my MO is like once I've gotten it out of the way, I won't come back to it. But it's hard for me to like get a depth and a connection with this. Like I feel like in this culture, it's like a massive withhold. Like I'm not lying, but I haven't fully revealed myself and this like huge part of myself. Not that it is me, but it's a huge part of me. So I feel like I'm always in a state of like the whole cancel culture thing has kind of seeped into my consciousness in the sense that I'm like, what's the point? They're going to find out. How are they going to respond? Will it be erratic? Will they feel betrayed? In the way that people have these really strong reactions once they find out you aren't like many of the other people that they know on this topic or whatnot. Don't follow the dominant paradigm in that sense. So that's so interesting. I love it. So this is the year you've just published a book, and this is the year you're going to start talking to your friends more about your work. I think that's amazing.
Well, here's something that maybe has changed since we were talking about developments over the past year. So I think I told you when we last spoke that the last time I saw my oldest childhood friend or one of my oldest childhood friends was at her house, and I raised the topic, and she said she didn't want to talk about it, which was weird. Did we talk about this? I think we did.
Yes, and she put her hands over her ears. Of course I remember.
She put her hands over her ears and she yelled, I don't want to talk about it, at the top of her lungs, and shook her head. So that was 2019, probably. So more recently, I had a former boss who is a professor at Stanford Law School. He was my boss from when I worked there. He reached out with an email, sort of casually, like, hi, are you still at this email address? And I thought, I bet he saw me on Tucker Carlson and he wants to talk. And I just wrote back and I said, yes, this is still my address. And he is a Democrat and he watches Tucker Carlson out of like a prurient, morbid fascination with American politics.
Oh my gosh.
So he saw me on Tucker Carlson and he wrote back and had this whole long thing um, explaining his concerns with my going on Tucker Carlson. But he
Mm.
wasn't necessarily concerned about my take on the issue. And we scheduled a time to talk and we talked about it like normal people, right? Like we just had a normal people conversation, very friendly, where I explained where I was coming from. He asked me if I had considered going on outlets like CNN. And I was like, yes, yes, I have, as a matter of fact. Um, but it was a teaching moment because he didn't know that mainstream lefty media outlets won't cover this topic.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
I think that was a little bit interesting and surprising for him to learn. So the reason I say all that is, contrast that conversation I had with my friend in 2019, which was, I don't want to talk about it, with this guy who expressed a genuine interest in what I'm talking about.
That shifted for me as well. I mean, I think part of I would say programming is that we're told like only speak to these people, only speak to these people. Do not compromise anything. do not send mixed messages. Like, can we not hold the reality that we agree on one issue and not others and still collaborate and still speak to one another? Like, I grew up in New York City, so everything was always about like, we're the smartest, we're the most educated, the most cultured, the most liberal, the most progressive, the most open-minded, yet there was zero tolerance for anything other than what we thought was right. Right. And then
Right.
it's only obviously gotten so much worse to the point, as you say in the book, if you do not affirm gender identity ideology, you are not only like wrong, but you're a fascist, you're a Nazi, you're a bigot. What happened to the original friend, like the one with the ears? Did you?
We had a few phone calls after that in which she just made it clear that she just didn't want to talk about it. And, unlike the people I hang out with socially in DC, she's one
Mhm.
of my closest friends. So it's kind of intolerable to talk and not about one of the most important aspects of my life.
Mm,
So we had a few conversations. She said she didn't want to talk about it. Then I got a really strange email from her where she talked about it and she said all of the things that she thinks, many of which I agreed with. Sometimes this conversation gets so silly. She said, I really think that some people are attracted to members of the same sex. And I was like, you don't have to convince me of that. Anyway, and she also pulled out the typical arguments around people with differences of sexual development. Well, of course that's true. But anyway, since she sent me this email explaining where she's coming from, I wrote her back and I said, I want to write you back and respond to what you've said, but you have also told me that we're not allowed to talk about it. So I don't
mm.
really know how to handle this email right now. And she never responded and we haven't spoken since.
Yeah, I feel like those dynamics have a short life, like that in between space that I've been in as well, and a lot of the women who come to me are in, where they want to hold on to the friendship, but it's painful to like not be able to like to have a kind of like an off switch set by the other person on what you can and cannot talk about, yet it always tends to kind of emerge in some way, like in the way that you described, where she does want to say something and then it's typically ends in withdrawal or separation or whatever. But yeah, it's a strange thing. It's a very like I think it's a very modern a friendship experience to say, hey, by the way, we can only talk about these certified belief systems around these topics. Everything else, just like pretend it's not there. Like setting the contract, setting the terms of the friendship is just like it's like bizarre. It's super super
It
weird.
is. It's bizarre and it's very one-sided.
Yeah.
So in the fall of 2016, my very lefty partner's parents voted Republican. So that caused a major rift in the family. His siblings are Republicans, but they broke ranks. They refused to vote for him. His parents voted for him. And that caused major and really deeply painful rifts in the family.
Mm.
So they all decided, they're five adult kids and two parents, they all decided they weren't going to talk about the November 2016 presidential election. And that worked. And they're still a close family. But that was because they all agreed to the term.
Mm.
They all agreed that it was best
Right.
for the family not to talk about November 2016. And they all kept to it. And their bonds are intact. But when it's very one-sided, dictatorial, I'm not talking to you about this.
Thank you for making that distinction. That is important. Yeah, the two sides agreeing to not versus one friend setting the terms of we are not talking about this, especially when it's like your whole thing. It's like your like great like your success. Like it's not just a thing you do. You are revered for this thing that you do that she doesn't want to talk about. Like it's very, very awkward. Like I've had that experience too, where I feel like I'm really proud of the podcast and I want to share the episodes. And I have a couple friends who are like, I'm really happy that you're happy. I'm really happy that you found something that you're passionate about. But like they won't name what the content of what I've done. Like they won't acknowledge that and the work there. It's very like individualistic. Like you're my friend, so I should be happy that you found something that you think is important and you're passionate about. Because I don't want you to suffer. But that's the only reason why.
Right.
Very, very, very strange. Okay, so that's really interesting. Okay, so you mentioned Jim Crow in the book, and I feel like that's, I think my audience would really appreciate you kind of expanding on that, because one of the, the talking points for enshrining gender ideology into the law is, as you mentioned in the book, is like anti-segregation, and to say that men and women should have separate spaces is you're like equivalent to a Jim Crow law.
Yeah. So I actually think that position is racist. So here's
Mm.
what I mean. Here's what I mean. The United States enacted and President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That was a massive victory for the civil rights movement in putting an end to racial segregation under Jim Crow. It was a massive victory for the rights of people of color, specifically Black people, because racial segregation under Jim Crow was profoundly, profoundly racist. And the Civil Rights Act was meant to remedy that. One of the most important provisions of the Civil Rights Act was the provision on public accommodations. Public accommodations refers to public places of business, restaurants, bars, roller rinks, movie theaters, arenas, whatever. And under legal Jim Crow, it was perfectly lawful to have, a bathroom for white people and a bathroom for what was then referred to as colored people. And most of us living today have no personal memory of that. I don't. I'm sure you don't. We've seen signs, and so we know what it was. But most of us have no personal recollection of what that was actually like. So that was a huge accomplishment to end racism in America. And now what is happening is this movement, which I will refer to as an industry. I know you've had Jen Billick on your program talking about the industry. It is hijacking one of the most important victories of the civil rights movement in the United States to advance the interests of men. And the simplest way that I can think to say it, and this is, I think I'm quoting myself verbatim, not paraphrasing, but women and men are simply different for the purpose of using something like a public bathroom in a way that women of different racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds are not different.
Mm.
Right? So most of us women, you're from New York. I use the example of Penn Station in the book because it's probably one of the best examples. Anyone who's ever been in the women's restroom in Penn Station in New York knows exactly what it's like to be in a women's room with women of all sorts of racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. And we all manage to treat each other with respect. We're all women, and that is what matters. And we're simply different from men in ways that matter for purposes of using the bathroom, in ways that we are not different from other women of it. Well, I should just say women of any racial, ethnic, or religious background. I think it's profoundly racist to say otherwise. It's similar to the argument, well, trans women are women in the same way that Black women are women. That is so profoundly racist because it is suggesting that Black women are somehow more like men than like other women, right? It's so othering of Black women, and it drives me crazy that people get away with saying trans women are women in the same way that Black women are women. I just think that's appalling.
The thing that stood out to me in 2020 was all the campaigns for Black trans women, but no Black women. Like all the newsletters, like with the George Floyd, like everything, it was just always Black trans women. But I hear what you're saying, and that's really helpful to kind of spell it out in that way. And it's funny that you mentioned Penn Station. I forgot that was the example that you used, because I actually have a friend who was verbally assaulted by a man in the women's restroom at Penn Station about 3 months ago.
It's similar to saying, that sometimes people will make the argument, well, then why don't you just exclude lesbians from women's bathrooms?
Right.
Well, because I've never felt, I will just say, I have never in my life felt in any way intimidated, assaulted, harassed, or made to feel in any way uncomfortable by any woman in a women's bathroom. I just haven't. And I don't, women don't ask
Right.
for sexual orientation. That's just not how it works in women's bathrooms. We go in, we do what we're doing, we wash our hands, we leave, and we're all nice to each other for the most part. I'm sure some bad things happen in women's bathrooms, but the false equivalence is just stunning.
Mm-hmm. And it's so homophobic. Like they can't imagine, like just because a person is attracted to a woman, then that must mean that they have taken on the kind of like predatory, misogynistic stereotypes of a man, like just by proxy, just from being sexually attracted to a woman. Like they can't imagine a reality where like a woman would be attracted to another woman and like not be a predator.
Right.
I mean, that's so sad. That's so pathetic. Wow. That comes up a lot. The DSD and the intersex thing comes up a lot. I feel like at least my audience has like a lot of clarity on that. But I think the fear of being called racist because of this false equivalency that you just named, it really does prevent a lot of women from speaking out. And I had Alex Aaron on recently, and she talked about this is all purposeful with the way that it's actually kind of unusual now to see trans just alone. There's a lot of Black trans, queer, BIPOC trans, right? So they've made the association with Black and trans. So to critique one must mean that you're racist or bigoted and, want racial segregation or, whatever. So that's been really purposeful.
I do think that it's absolutely purposeful. I was also just going to mention, it is sometimes argued that sex is a social construct invented by European colonizers. Okay, that is so racist in that it says that people of the global South didn't know how babies were made before white Europeans came around to tell them. It's ridiculous. It is so ridiculous.
And even take it further that they like aren't mammals, because as mammals we know that we are a sexually dimorphic species. So what are they suggesting that there's some kind of like alien? Like it's almost saying that they're not human. To say that someone doesn't know how babies are made, or almost is to suggest that they're not mammals and not even like human. Like
it's so insulting.
wow, I never thought about it like that. There are so many tangential like conversations around that in terms of like the way that people were enslaved, and indigenous people of Americas had long, some of the indigenous populations had really long hair, and so part of the kind of enslavement was to cut people's hair, to cut them, and it was specifically the men's hair, and then that gets turned into everyone's always been non-binary.
Right.
There's never been a sexually dimorphic species because these men had long hair. Like it's just wow, the way that it's kind of brilliant, the way that they've done it in like a sick, evil genius way. I wanted to talk about the headlines. I love the part in the book where you kind of unpack the trans-inducing headlines, like such as I'm gonna read a few. So page 81, you say, consider a few recent headlines. Wave of bills to block trans athletes has no basis in science, researchers say. Right. So like the blocking the trans athletes, like always coming back to the oppressor who wants to make life so hard for the trans athletes, aka saying no to men and women's sports. And then another one you had was the example you used was the bans on transgender athletes, 6 facts. And then the third, federal government reinstates healthcare protections for transgender Americans. How patriotic.
Right. And when the headlines talk about healthcare or when someone talks about banning healthcare for transgender Americans, no one's talking about banning healthcare for any Americans. They're talking about debates that really need to be had about the extent to which the government and or insurance companies should be required to cover cosmetic surgeries for people who want to pretend that they're the opposite sex. I think that's a completely legitimate public policy discussion to have. Should insurance companies be required to cover cosmetic surgeries for people who want to pretend to be the opposite sex? I would argue no. Somebody might argue yes. Fine, but that's a legitimate conversation to have. That's a far different thing from saying that anyone's trying to ban healthcare. This country obviously has a lot of public policy discussions that need to be had about how to provide quality healthcare to all Americans. No one's come up with a really good way of doing that. But there's so many conversations that need to be had about how to provide quality healthcare for all Americans. But nobody's suggesting that any kind of healthcare be banned.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so misleading. It's so disingenuous.
It is. It's a way that they've really captured the population with the language, even calling it a treatment, or even the term transgender medicine, as you said it. Yeah, but when you spell it out in the way that you did, which I would totally agree is a way more accurate way of like depicting what's going on, doesn't sell very well. It does not sound like a civil rights issue because it's not. It's and then like who wants to give someone a scholarship because they need a lot of cosmetic surgery? Like it just doesn't have a good ring to it.
No, it doesn't. But what does have a good ring to it? Transgender.
It certainly does. It certainly does. And like with the prisons, I mean, we could talk a little about what's going on with the prisons. I spoke with Amy Ichikawa and the act in California. I think it's called the Respect and Dignity Act, or something of that nature, right? So what that's suggesting is if you oppose it, you want to disrespect. You don't want respect and dignity for these individuals, primarily men. It's simple once it's spelled out, but I do think it's so important, and that's I think the effectiveness of the book is that it just so clearly spells out the ways in which we've been captured and like why it's all a farce, really, is what the book is like. This is not what you think it is, and here's why. Are you following what's going on in the California state prisons? Like, can you speak more on that as well?
Sure. So the people who can really speak most effectively are Amy, and I'm
Mhm.
so glad to hear that you had her on, and also the women at Wolf who have a lawsuit pending in
Mm.
federal court in California. A bill called SB 132 was passed in 2020 and signed by Governor Gavin Newsom, and it went into effect in January of 2021. My understanding is that over the course of 2021, hundreds of applications were submitted by men to be transferred to the women's. I don't have the data on how many of those have been granted. Some number have been, for sure, versus how many are pending. To the best of my knowledge, not a single one has been denied. And shortly after those transfers started happening, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, started handing out condoms to women in the women's prison.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, that's deeply concerning, or not, from the perspective of preventing pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. It's good, but here's the thing: the department anticipated that these men would be raping the incarcerated women, and also the reason that the prison handed out the condoms is because they know that these prisoners are men. They know that they are transferring men into women's prisons. And the reason we know they know that is because women cannot get other women pregnant. Only men can get women pregnant. And so handing out condoms is an implicit acknowledgement that these people are men, which shoots an arrow right through the lie that trans women are women.
Mm. Yeah.
Men aren't women, and everyone knows it.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know how they're gonna dig themselves out of that one. And like also Amy had mentioned in our interview that there were also educational like posters for like adoption options. Like not just the rape, but that like, oh, sex between men and women leads to a baby. Like there are going to be babies, not just rape, but rape that leads to live children. I mean,
Yes.
it's like how the fuck are they, sorry, how the hell are they gonna, like deal with that one after? I mean, because it's one thing to have the lexicon and kind of visually trick people on a kind of surface level, but I don't know. I don't know how they're gonna. What do you think is gonna, like? What's your prediction about what's gonna happen when these women are to term and give birth?
I mean, it's important to note that it is the very trickery and the use of language that leads to all of these other things. The use of language makes all the other things inevitable, absolutely inevitable. So, yeah, this is why feminists have been complaining about this for so long.
Mm-hmm.
What do I think is going to happen when all these women carry to term? I don't know if they will. I don't know if I don't know what
Mm-hmm.
the department's going to do. I can imagine mandatory abortion policies. I can imagine. I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
really don't know.
Yeah.
I can imagine, as things are so bad, I can imagine mandatory abortions happening in secret under the radar.
Wow. Wow. Oh, right. Like being medicated against their will. And yeah. 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 And I guess it's also important to note that women in women's prisons can also get pregnant from being abused by the prison guards. Like that's also a thing. So,
Yeah, that is
and
absolutely a thing. Um, oh, so are you suggesting they would just like shove it under the rug by saying that's what happened?
maybe I could see that. I could see that being one kind of cover up. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure Amy probably provided some data on the racial breakdown. Black and brown women are disproportionately represented among the prison population. I mean, I think we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
torture. Maybe they'll start sterilizing these women.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
sterilization of black and brown women in our country isn't new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, we did get into that a little bit with in our episode as well with yeah, okay. So it's not as if they haven't done terrible things before, terrible things haven't happened in prisons before. This is just like a whole new level of socially, like this is now a socially acceptable in some respects level of entrapment for these women. Like you have people saying that these men deserve safe spaces away from predators in the men's prisons, or whatever the case for it might be. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I really worry about is mandatory sterilization in order to prevent pregnancy, in order to
Mm,
prevent, you know, having to answer the question that you asked, which is what's going to happen when all these babies come to term. Well, an easy but disgusting solution to that problem is to sterilize all these women.
right, right. Wow. Oh God. So you mentioned you were feeling like optimistic in this moment. Where do you think, what is that about? Has something happened recently where you feel like there's been more headway, or do you feel like it's the release of the book and the response to the book? Like what makes you think 2022 might be better
I
than
think there's more
2021?
momentum. I think more people are talking about it. I think the case of Leah Thomas in Pennsylvania woke up a lot of people. So Leah Thomas is a man who swam for 3 years on the men's swim team at the University of Pennsylvania, which is where I went to law school. So this one's a little personal for me. And after 1 year of suppressing his testosterone levels, he was permitted to swim on the women's team. And the images coming out of the meets where he is just dominating the races and past records. He's breaking past records, which were hard earned by women. Images of him in a women's bathing suit with his, you know, obviously male genitalia, um, I think are piquing a lot of people. And they're also, these images are not only piquing a lot of people, but they're empowering people who have already peaked to say, okay, this is it.
Yeah.
This is it. Come on. Um, it's not enough, but I think we're going to see some headway in 2022. I do. I'm also I'm heartened, as depressing as 2021 was. When President Biden took office, or sorry, before he took office, he vowed to get the so-called Equality Act enacted by Congress within 100 days of taking office. He failed miserably, not only in getting it enacted within 100 days of taking office, but in getting it enacted at all in 2021. So back in December, when the Senate adjourned, the House had already passed it in earlier 2021, and it sat on the floor of the Senate for 9 months, going nowhere. And I am optimistic that it went nowhere. So we're Women's Declaration International now. At the time, we were Women's Human Rights Campaign, and we submitted a letter to Majority Leader Schumer, the head of the Senate, signed by over 1,500 women all over the world, telling him, if you pass this law, it is going to have devastating consequences for women and girls all over the world. We sent it to him. And when I say that, I don't mean that we hit send on a button on a website. I mean, we had previously been in contact with a key staffer in his office. We had her direct individual email address and we sent it to her. She confirmed receipt and she assured us that she would send our letter to Majority Leader Schumer. I don't know if that had any bearing on his decision not to bring the bill to a vote. I would like to think it had some.
Wow.
Regardless, he knew he didn't have the votes. Or maybe he agrees with us. I don't know. But regardless, he did not bring that bill to the floor, which means that it didn't get enacted in 2020. We may see it come back in 2022. We'll do what we can to fight it then. This is a federal bill that would essentially obliterate intimate spaces for women and girls. It would erase women and girls as a sex class completely throughout federal civil rights law. So we're very invested in it not being passed.
Well, that's amazing. And motivation to keep going. Because I feel like in some of my circles there are a lot of strategies for dealing with what's going on. And I find that a lot of women want to withdraw, and I can relate to that. It gives me hope that these direct action strategies that Women's Declaration International are, just having so much headway. Yeah, that the direct action strategies work, and I think there's a huge lack. I'll speak for myself. I certainly, when I started talking about this, I felt, and I still feel inadequate in what I can do in a really tangible way with direct action, with writing to reps that actually isn't just, as you said, just sending a form on a website. So I'm so grateful that Women's Declaration International is not only doing it, but that it's working. I think women need to know that there are things we can do and that they are effective, right? We're not just throwing darts here.
Absolutely. So I feel like this sometimes. I feel overwhelmed. I feel disheartened and I just want to quit. I have that too. I think we all do. And so I will just offer this in terms of what I do when I feel like that. Maybe it's useful, maybe it's not. So does your audience know who Magdalen Burns was?
Some of them will, some of them won't.
Sure. So Magdalen Burns was a UK feminist, lesbian activist, very popular YouTuber who had a phenomenal sense of humor and a tremendous amount of insight into how damaging this movement is for women and girls. And she's got a huge following on YouTube. And she got a brain tumor in 2019, and she ultimately died at the age of 36 in September 2019. And before she died, she had one last YouTube video, and the last words of her YouTube video are "keep fighting." So whenever I want to give up, I think about her. I think about everything she gave to the movement. And I think that giving up would be a total dishonoring of her memory. And I'm sorry, I'm tearing up. It's ridiculous, but I do every time I talk about this.
For anyone who hasn't seen her videos, they are truly hysterical and so impactful and so fierce. And she's so effortless in her delivery. She's just like, it's a man, mate. He's got a dick.
Yeah. She's like, you're a bloke.
Yeah.
It's fine. Be a bloke.
Oh, that's that. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there's the keep going. Yeah, totally. And it also takes the pressure off in one sense. It's not like do it right or like this is your last chance. It's like literally just keep going. Where can women buy your book?
Okay, thank you. So it's on Amazon. You can just Google Amazon, Abolition of Sex, it will come up. For those of us who hate Amazon and don't want to buy anything off Amazon, which I totally understand, it's also available at Barnes & Noble. You're welcome to visit me at karadansky.com or on Twitter at @kdansky. If there's anyone watching who has not signed the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, please sign the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. If you just Google Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, it'll come right up and there's a place to sign your name. And once you do, you're always welcome to visit womensdeclarationusa.com, which tells you a lot about what we're doing here in the US. And there's a volunteer form where you can submit the form. Women, our volunteers are all women, and submit the form, and one of our volunteer coordinators will be in touch with you and get you on board.
Thank you so much, Kara. I want every woman to read this. And I should say, I don't want to say it's an easy read because that makes it sound like it's not like significant, but it's really easy to read in that it's very clear and it's not like a textbook. Like I like how you can just like fit it in your bag. It's not super dense in the sense that like you get a headache, unless you're getting peaked, in which case you're going to get a lot of headache.
Yeah,
in a good way.
Also, there's an ebook. You can. Okay, there's a Kindle version, and an audio version is in the works.
Oh, amazing! Oh, that's so awesome. Oh, I know a lot of women, a lot of moms especially, are going to totally do the audio version. That's awesome.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support my work, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To stay in the loop for my latest coaching programs, hypnosis sessions, free resource guides, and more, follow me on Instagram at whosebodyisit and visit my website, whosebodyisit.com.